So not quite close you out. This will be the last time we're all together in this big room, but there are super sessions and special sessions and more workshops happening after this. We really wanted to take full advantage of the fact that we were on the West Coast, which meant some of you are staying over, and we wanted to make sure you didn't get outside. You got to stay inside longer and go to more fun stuff. So we're just delighted to have had you here with us, and it's wonderful to see the room still be full. What we're going to do this time, hopefully third time is a charm, we're really trying to figure out how we engage, 600 people in conversation, in lively discussion. So we tried the Slido, and that had some challenges, just having the questions pop up automatically by how many people had voted for them. We may not have gotten to the most pressing ones or the most relevant ones. We can always try the mics, and then sometimes people don't want to get up and make it all the way across the room to the mic. So this time we're going to try 3 things to ensure that we get you in discussion. We're going to go back and use the slido.com for you to put in questions and comments. But this time, rather than just having them pop up automatically, Marita Irby, Executive Vice President and co-founder of the forum, is going to come up and sort of look through them and pull out the ones that make the most sense for us to try to answer. So we'll be doing that. We will also have the mics, and we'll acknowledge you if you come to the mics. And then if you're really bold and you want to join the conversation, we have 4 chairs up here, and they're just 2 of us. And so when we get to the part where we're just going to have discussion, if you really want to come join into the discussion, we invite you to come up on stage and join us, and we have 2 mics. So 3 ways to participate, and we hope that you'll pick one of them. The other thing that I'll say quickly is we know that there were questions yesterday that we didn't fully get to. We have those captured. That's one of the nice things about Slido. All of those things will be captured. And in the spirit of really making sure that this conversation continues through the year, all the folks that you heard yesterday, who again are also our partners, have agreed to do thought leader roundtable conversations with us over the next couple of months. And we will take those questions that they didn't ask. We won't let them get away with not answering them. We'll take them into those sessions and kick it off. So we want you to really be fully engaged. And you're going to hand me this. Great, thank you. So my job, which is always a challenging job to get to the end of the conference, was to figure out if there were things that we often talk about that we hadn't sort of pull up to the main stage, to listen throughout the conference and sort of tie up things that sort of came out that were aha moments, and make sure that we're leaving really charged and ready, and in particular leaving with you knowing what we hope to be doing next. So I think that this session has a very long name, Blurring the Lines, Being Allies in the Pursuit of Readiness, Equity, and Quality. And we're going to sort of talk through a little bit, a pause in between 3 sessions to see if there are clarifying questions. If you put them in Slido, I'll ask Marita if there are some questions that we need to answer, and then we're going to try our best to sort of have time at the end in which we can engage in people in chairs, in mics, in questions, and in dancing if you prefer. So let's get going. So readiness is where this conversation started. More than a decade ago, when we started to talk about making sure young people were ready by 21, ready for college, work, and life. And at some point, we decided that we just have to be bold and say readiness should be a right for all young people. We now know enough about the science of learning and development. We know clearly that every young person has skills and talents that really can help them meet their full potential, that we should be able to say that this is a right. But we can't do it without working together. And so we talk about changing the odds a lot, and we know that the path to improved outcomes really does come when we literally try to change the odds so that young people and their families are not left to try to beat them individually. And that means that we have to really change the conversation from a simple conversation about equality, about access, and about completion. Did young people complete high school? Did they complete a post-secondary degree? We've got to push the conversation to be a broader conversation about equity, which we've clearly been talking about in this conference, about quality, one of the buzzwords, not even a buzzword, one of the anchoring words of the forum's work, and then obviously about not just completion but readiness. And we have ample evidence that when we don't push all the way to those big words, we don't do justice to young people and the time that they're putting in to try to move their lives forward. So what we're challenging all of us to do is to think differently. And I want to just take a few minutes to make sure we all know that there are many ways we can think differently. This little slide that I'm going to put up was made in the course of working with the Boys and Girls Club of Greater Richmond, which called us in a couple years ago and said, we keep coming to the conferences and you talk about changing the odds, and we want to know what we can do as the Boys and Girls Club of Richmond to change the odds. What would that really look like, and how would we sell that to our board? So we said, well, let's see what it means to go from beating the odds to changing the odds. At one time, you're a Boys and Girls Club, you've got buildings. You've got young people coming into buildings. You set a goal to say, why don't we get more young people coming in? So we set a goal to really expand our services and serve more young people. Then we say, we've got the young people coming, we're building relationships, but maybe there are other folks we can bring into the building to diversify the content that we're offering. So maybe we're offering art, maybe we're offering STEM, maybe we're offering other things that we don't have the expertise in, but we've built the relationships. We're building up the number of people coming in. Let's take advantage of that. That's great. We're on a great path. But we're still helping young people beat the odds because we're just relying on who's coming in the building. So the next question was, well, who else is serving young people in our neighborhoods? Do we know who the other programs and partners are? Are there things that we could do working with them that would actually help us together serve the young people in this neighborhood more fully? So that conversation started. Now we're really moving towards not just beating the odds with the young people who happen to come in to our programs, but really thinking more systemically about how we can change the odds. Then the question came up once they came together, well, we're providers. We are a network now of program providers trying to make a commitment to serve more young people, but there are things going on in many of our neighborhoods that really are broader contexts and broader issues that are sort of pulling us down. What do we do about those? And they really said, should we be tackling big issues? Is it our job to tackle housing? Is it our job to tackle transportation? Are those things all ours? And the answer was, we need to be aware of them. And this was a wonderful conversation they had with their board. We need to be aware of those. We can't change our core mission to do all those, but we could learn to be advocates. We could bring the voices of the young people and families into the organizations and the systems that do have that as their day job. And then the end of that was, why don't we also bring the young people and families in our organizations into a position where they are actually, their voices are present advocating for the changes that they want to see in their community. So maybe our job isn't to fix those bigger problems, but maybe our job is to really help the young people and families that we work with understand the role they can play in advocating, which is the conversation we had this morning. So I just wanted to start with that to tie up, we said learning is social and emotional. And we also know that when we really help young people and adults build their skills and competencies to take action, to take agency, that we're really helping those skills in not just an academic way. We're really helping people prepare for changing their own lives and changing their own communities. So we can think differently as providers, as program providers, as teachers, as youth workers. We can think differently about what we can do to change the odds by looking outside of the doors of our programs and classrooms to figure out how we really help young people and families advocate for themselves. We can also think differently, and you've seen this up yesterday, and the big theme that we're going to work on the next 4 or 5 years is how we can get systems and communities to change the odds by thinking differently about the settings where learning happens. And those of you who know me know I've started to beat the drum about this idea of, we talk about school and out of school, or school and after school. And the challenge with that is we're naming places, but we're not really talking about what happens inside of those places. And so when we think about where learning happens, and you push on it, inside of each of those, inside of school and inside of after school or inside of community or inside of our rec departments, inside of the buildings that sort of symbolize the systems, are different kinds of learning opportunities. And the more we can start to name those and get comfortable talking about the settings where learning and development could happen, the more we can build up the muscle to ask the question about whether those settings are as strong and positive as they can be. They're different. They have different constraints. They have different opportunities, right? I mean, if you just close your eyes for a second and think, a ball field, a science lab, an auditorium, and a classroom. They just physically look different. There's some things you can do and can't do in those settings. And then you can wrap around that the expectations of the adults about what they should be doing with young people in those settings. So when we start to describe settings by their characteristics, we can get a much more granular way to think about whether learning and development are happening. The conversations we were having yesterday with Michael and with Hal. So I'm going to come back to those big ideas, but what I want to do is just set up sort of 3 topics today for discussion. One is we talk a lot about changing the odds, but that means we actually have to do much more to know the odds and know what could change them and understand the power of interventions, whether those interventions are big or small. The second thing is we spent a lot of time yesterday talking about this new science and these new frames that have come out. The science of learning and development, the brain research, the information that's come out from the commission, and we put a lot of that in your bags. Take it home with you, I hope, because it's really important and exciting work that I think can help us blur the lines in the conversations that we have about how we can use systems to change the trajectory for young people's lives. And then the third thing I want to talk about is just really what practically we can do now. What the forum is going to try to do now, what you can do now. I know that one of the things in the conversations yesterday was there were questions coming in saying, this is great, we're with you, we believe you, we're snapping, but give me an example of what we can do now. And we know that that urgency is there. So let's go through these 3 things. At the end of each section, I will sort of pause to see if anything's coming in through Slido, if there are any clarifying questions, and then we'll have some time at the end. So this idea of changing the odds has been around for a long time. I think I talked about it first not that long after I got out of college, when I was really trying to sort of figure out in my own head why I had succeeded and some kids hadn't from my neighborhood. And I started playing with this idea. But about 8 or 9 years ago, I got a chance to be a part of something called the Social Genome Project. I was not one of the researchers, I was just one of the advisors, because this is heavy-duty research. But they started this project. This was a large simulation project where they put together dozens of data sets to basically make up a simulated model of young people moving from birth through to young adulthood. And the question they asked was, if we start with young people, basically with families that are forming, and some of those families are low income and poverty, the families are all across the ranges, what would it take to get all of those babies born to be middle class by middle age, right? So to be sort of, 300% above poverty by the age 30. What would it take to really make them solidly middle class? And that was the conversation that they had. So in doing this work, they came up with the determinants of, at each developmental stage, what it meant to be on track. What helped you have the likelihood that you were moving forward towards that goal of being middle class by middle age? And the things on that list shouldn't surprise you, right? Family formation, if you were born into a family that had delayed parenthood, your family was married, there was adequate education and employment, you were born normal birth rate as a baby, you're more likely to be on track. I won't read the whole list, but you can hopefully see that and see that this is not rocket science, which was what it made it a neat model. The second thing was they said, well, at every developmental stage, what do we have? Who's on track and who's not? And you'll see that basically in every developmental stage, more than half of young people are on track, and about 40% are off track, right? Don't have those characteristics that would have them be predicted to go on to be middle class by middle age. So if you're a glass half full person, that's good news, right? More of our kids are on track than off track. But that's not where the interesting part came. It came with understanding that in every developmental stage, being on track wasn't a guarantee that you were going to stay on track, right? So you can see those little numbers in the arrows going down, 70%, 60%. Most of the kids who were on track stayed on track, but not all. So there's variation in that. And the same was true, even more important, for young people who are off track. Young people who are off track in one developmental stage don't stay off track. So there's movement back and forth. Now that's where the fun comes in, because we've now sort of, how many folks have sort of heard policymakers or other folks, even educators, say, well, if we don't get them by third grade, it's all over, right? It's not worth the effort. It's not worth the investment. And this is clearly saying that's not true, that at every developmental stage, there are young people who move from being off track to being on track, but equally important, there are young people who were on track who move off track. This is a complicated study. You can go look it up, Social Genome Project, and see all the different things they did with this simulation model, which is still around, and you can sort of have analyses done. But the message is there is movement, and that movement must be due to something. So let's back up a second and look at it. Clearly, being on track is more important than being advantaged, right? So the least advantaged young people and families are in the dark blue, and the more advantaged are in the light blue. Now, you can see that if you were never on track, down at the bottom, about 20% of young people throughout their whole developmental period were never on track. And about 30% of those who were in more advantaged families were never on track. But it goes up. And so the message here is that yes, being more advantaged helps, but somehow, whether you were born into an advantaged family or not, the family you were born in is not as important as the reality that you actually are moving from one stage to the next on track. And that means there's a lot of room for us to come in with interventions. You can ask about income. Kids who were born into less advantaged families are, again, less likely to be on track at each life stage. So if we slice it that way, we know income matters. But again, somehow being able to be on track can overcome those income gaps. I'm going to come back to that circle in the middle. You'll see the biggest gap is in adolescence. Those young people sort of 13 to 19. We have a big gap there. The same is true for young people of color. Obviously, in this country at least, Black and Hispanic young people are less likely to be on track, and that likelihood goes down as they get older. So if we're going to talk about what are the odds for young people, we need to have ways to actually have data on it. We need to have ways to disaggregate the data, but it's also important as we're doing that to figure out creative ways to not lock young people into expectations that if once they're off track, they're going to stay off track. And that's one of the reasons why every year we try some way to remind you all that this survey and this study exists, because there's a lot of potential. So if there's room, and if we've got those arrows going in both directions, then the question, and this is a policy study, so their question was really, what helped, right? So this was the Brookings Institute and the Urban Institute, big policy shops, and they did this work because they wanted to ask, what are the interventions at each life stage that seem to help us move young people from being off track to being on track? And again, you can see them, and these are, again, not rocket science, but it says when we introduce interventions, most of these are public interventions, they're looking at public policies, it does seem to make a difference. How much do they help? You can see here the gaps between if they had the intervention and they didn't have the intervention. So that little white box is the effect of early childhood, for example. The effect of actually offering early childhood programs to young people who were low income, you've got them almost up to being as likely to be on track as young people who were coming from more affluent families. That's the most positive story. The least positive story is, again, in adolescence. The interventions that we offer in adolescence don't seem to make much of a difference. When you look at it, however, not just early childhood, and I was just looking at early childhood over time, because that clearly would go down. When you look at multiple interventions, the story is much better. If we keep putting interventions in place that move young people forward, we do a pretty good job of closing the gap between low-income and higher-income kids, again, except in adolescence. I keep coming back to except in adolescence because most of us in this room here are working with adolescents, and that's the place where our interventions seem to be least successful. And we could pause, and you should think about it and start to put some questions and ideas on why are we so unsuccessful in adolescence in coming up with things that actually help young people move forward? Why is that the weak spot in our system? So I'm going to leave you with that question, but tell you that it's also the case when we look at the black-white gap. Interventions to reduce the gaps between low-income and more affluent children, interventions seem to work. Trying to reduce the gaps between white and black seem to make a difference, except in adolescence, right? So the gap gets narrower, except in adolescence. And again, we'll have all these online. I know I'm going through them quickly, but I'm trying to set up the conversation, because if we start to say, how do we act now, we don't often have time to do major, big interventions. And there is something going on in adolescence that I think all the things we've been talking about for the past 2 days can be very, very helpful with. We can step in at a much more granular level and change the trajectory of school-age and adolescent children's lives through relationship-rich interventions, not sort of big public interventions necessarily. Because if you remember those arrows back on that first chart, and I won't go backwards, most of these interventions are designed to move kids from being off track to being on track. But you notice that there are arrows just as big going from on track to off track. And that's where a lot of our work comes in, right? If we notice that young people are moving from off track to on track, and we step in with relationships, with customized ideas about what can happen, if we actually are knowing the young people that we're working with, a lot of our interventions are not about moving kids from off to on. It's about keeping kids who are on track, but just barely on track, keeping them on track. That's a lot of what we do, but we can't do that if we don't know our young people. So I'm going to pause, see if this idea of really digging in to know what the odds are for young people, making sure that we know what the odds are for different subpopulations of young people, making sure we know what the odds are at different age groups, and figuring out how to bring that information into our conversations. That was something we're going to have to get better at if we're really going to figure out how to change the odds for young people. Anything come in I should know, Rita?
Second.
There you go.
Greetings. Hi, I'm Marita. And I want to say greetings and hi in particular to the 60 or 70 local leaders from the Seattle-Tacoma area that just have joined us at this session and are going to be with us through the afternoon. Wave your hands if you're in the room. Everybody else who's been for the last day, I'd like to make them welcome. And thank you. Thank you for being here. And so it is about how you make this work happen locally. So we're so excited that you're here. And I also just want to flag this thing that Karen keeps referring to of the go on the app if you want to and put in a question, clarifying questions, especially right now, is called Slido, SLIDO.com. SLIDO, like slide, but O, Slido.com. And if you have some questions you want to put in while she's chatting, that's great. We're also going to have the mics up and have that fuller conversation at the end. All right?
Okay.
And for everybody else, that was your reminder.
All right. So I'm going to keep going and even speed up, because the things I'm going to show now are things that you've seen over the course of the 2 days, and I just want to sort of wrap up and remind us why they're there. So we have talked a lot, and we have in your bags the executive summary of A Nation at Hope, as well as on your Sched app, the link to all the resources at A Nation at Hope, and we gave you the issue brief from the work group. The reason we did that is because one way to really think about interventions is to think about ideas as interventions. There's a book written a couple decades ago called The Power of Public Ideas. And we're on the verge of really being able to shape some public ideas about learning and development, that if we can really get them into the water clearly and broadly, that really sets the stage for a different type of public policy. It sets the stage for different decisions at the organizational level. And so I want to make sure that you all know that, at least from where we sit at the forum, this investment in getting this commission and in getting the Science of Learning and Development called SOLD initiative, getting that work together, getting it out, having it not seen as competing with other frames, but really as consensus documents that can help us move forward, it helps us move ideas to impact, which is a part of what the forum does. So the commission and you've got this in your bags, the Commission set out 6 recommendation areas. And when you look at them, these are really recommendation areas that you can take across systems. That we should set a clear vision that broadens the definition of success, that we should transform learning settings to make sure they're safe and supportive, that we should change instruction to teach social, emotional, and cognitive skills, and embed those in academics and school-wide practices. If you're not in school, you could take out the word academics in school and stick in your own words, but you can see this. To build adult expertise in child development, to align resources and leverage partners, and then to forge closer relationships between research and practice. Those are really big, broad recommendation areas that have specific recommendations under them. And the bullets that you see there are the subset of those specific recommendations that speak directly to blurring the lines, that speak directly to aligning across systems, aligning across sectors. And that was really an important part of the work that we did with the Commission, to make sure that the recommendations coming out had room for us to come in and partner, to really blur those lines between building and not building. So you have that in your bags and you have the access. You also have in your bags a summary document that we made because all the graphics were not in the executive summary. And so SEED put out only 4 graphics. The How Learning Happens graphic, or the science of how learning happens, the evidence base, which really sort of describes those social and emotional skills, cognitive skills, life skills put together. You've got the graphic of the practice base for how learning happens, which is sort of the theory. You've got an ecosystem graphic, and then you have the graphic that was made specifically by the Youth Development Work Group, which I just showed you, sort of broadening the base for where learning happens. It was a big deal for a commission that worked for 2 years to come up with 4 graphics and to have us be included, and us, by us I mean the broader sort of youth development, youth services field, to have us be included in all of those graphics. And so these are things that we should leverage. We don't have to love the graphics, I love the ideas. Some of these are already being remade. Rita and company have already sort of pulled them apart and started to work with them, but they really embody consensus around how to talk about this and how to talk about it to K-12 schools. So this first graphic of SEED affirms that skills and competencies are important for learning. And when I had the meeting this morning with the Weikert breakfast and we were doing our ahas, one of the people that I met said her aha was that we were talking about social, interpersonal, emotional, and cognitive skills and competencies, not just social, emotional, and academic. And that was a big deal. And it was a big deal. It took a while to sort of move this forward. We couldn't change the name of the whole commission, but getting the idea that cognitive skills, executive function, higher order thinking skills, whatever you call them, that those cognitive skills like critical thinking and problem solving and judgment, those kinds of skills, mindfulness, aren't just connected to academics. They're connected to any kind of content, and they're needed for you to master any kind of content. So it was a big deal to get that pulled apart so that in any setting where young people are spending their time, we can have an expectation that all 3 broad types of skills can be built together. The second thing is that, again, I'm going to go back and forth between these 2 big research-heavy studies and initiatives that have come out. The building blocks for learning development, or that framework that's come out of the SOLD work, the Science of Learning and Development, again, they help us organize the words. We have so many words of so many skill lists of things we want young people to have, right? Resilience, grit, agency, problem solving, executive function, self-regulation. The lists go on and on. These are 2 frames that just help you take what we know about them and how they're built and scaffolded and organize them. Rita's going to run a session for 2 hours after this that's really about how do you take these various frames and figure out when to use them, how to use them, if they're compatible, because they really are. But if you just look at them and say, I'll pick the one I like, this one has a color scheme that matches my stuff, I'll pick this one, that doesn't quite work. So we really want you to know that they're here and they're compatible, and a part of us being able to move ideas to impact is being a little more nimble about the various frames that are coming out. These frames are also consistent with where we've been for a long time. So one of the things that we did as Youth Development Field in 2002 was to just sort of get the National Research Council to give us some common language. And at that point, they talked about predicting young adult success as physical development, intellectual, psychological, and emotional, and social. And you'll see, so that green language underneath, a lot of those skills were already being named and put under there. Some of you heard Camille Farrington yesterday. She was up on the stage. Again, you have her Foundations for Young Adult Success in your bags. Some of you may have picked up the full book. You've all got the infographic. Rita's going to have more of the books in her session this afternoon immediately after this. But this idea of, again, binding it together and saying it's not just a bunch of skills. The long-term goal is that young people have a sense of agency, a sense of integrated identity, and a broad set of competencies that will do them well in college or post-secondary education, in work, in life. And that the mindsets, the values, the self-regulation, and that base of knowledge and skills are what young people need to have. And then what's nice about this one is it goes on to say they don't get those skills until they are able to act and reflect. And you heard Camille talk a little bit about that yesterday, the importance of making sure young people have opportunities to act and reflect. And that model can be brought into any place where they're spending their time. That's how learning gets engaged and happened. So we do have a bunch of frames. We need to get more nimble with them. And we need to understand when and where and how to bring them into different settings so that we can make the case for a different way to approach and support young people's development. The Commission also, with that second graphic, confirms a theory of action that, again, those of us in the youth development field, and frankly, those of us in any field understand, which is that the quality of the learning setting determines the quality of the student experience or the youth experience, determines whether they learn anything. I mean, that's just, we heard a lot of that yesterday, and this frame supports it. And again, it's a big deal that this has come out written for a K-12 audience, that we're talking about learning settings, and that we're actually putting student experience actively in the middle of this piece. So the learning settings, again, safe and relationship-based environments, we're really pushing that idea, embedding social, emotional, and cognitive skill development in academic learning or whatever kind of learning we're doing, and then teaching and practicing those skills explicitly, right? Very easy to take this language and generalize it to any setting, but a big deal that it's there and that language is then linked with the student experience, starting again with this idea of belonging and connection as the thing that grounds students' experiences, and then that they are engaged and they're owning, they have a sense of purpose with what they're doing, and then obviously that they're actually being handed some rigorous and challenging material. Again, generalize it, and all that leads to a broad set of outcomes, which are the ones that we all know we want for young people. So that frame is very consistent, and that idea of quality is very consistent with the idea of quality that the Weichert Center has used for years, embedded in the conversations that we have about quality. That yes, quality is about instruction. Yes, quality is about academic content or whatever kind of content you're bringing in, but quality is also about context. It's consistent with what the National Research Council told us were the settings, the features of positive developmental settings. I won't read the list to you. And it's consistent with the graphic we put up yesterday from the Science of Learning and Development, right? That you can't pick and choose, that to get optimal development and learning, young people need to have strong relationships, safe environments in which they belong, rich instructional experiences, individualized supports that people are noticing what's going on with them, and intellectual development of those critical skills and mindsets. Huge amount of consistency in these frames. They come out differently. Some have 5 elements, some have 3 elements, but we need to be nimble in understanding that we've got a unique opportunity to bring the science of learning and development into our work. So going down the home stretch, the other graphic that really was a big deal was to get a graphic from K-12 folks that named who's in the education ecosystem, and in particular that named that ring called local community. I don't know how many people remember the cover of the New Yorker where you had sort of New York City in great detail and then just the world out there. But often it sort of feels like we have school in great detail and then community. And like, who is the community? And so they named youth development organizations, local employers, health and social services, faith-based organizations, civic organizations, so that we're asking who's out there in the community that we should be partnering with, who's offering opportunities for learning and development, and how do those settings differ? Okay? How do they complement what happens in schools? How can we really look at this from a broader perspective? So the final thing that happened, again, is that ring, that orange ring of partners, that were a part of the commission came together as a work group and basically said, we want to write a brief that explains more about what we do and who we are, because we don't just operate out of school or after school. Sometimes we're in school. Sometimes we're in the summer. Sometimes we're all over the place with young people working with you, and we need to be more known and understood. They looked at the recommendations and made sure they were in them. A big part of why those recommendations are broader is because this group really actively works to help shape the recommendations. And then, of course, they really helped create this graphic to explain who they are and where they work and push this idea of thinking more granularly, not just about school and community, but naming the places where learning can happen. I could have a library in lots of places. I could have a library in school. I could have a freestanding library. I could have a library in my housing project. All of those are libraries. They're in different settings. They're in different systems. How do we understand what happens in those and how we use them? So that was a conversation that started, and that conversation is going to continue because that work group, as well as the equity work group, has really made a commitment to keep this work going past the commission, which ended in January. I'm going to pause there. Anything come in that I should stop for, Marita?
Hold it for the conversation.
Okay, so then let's talk quickly about how do we take action now. So we know that equity has to be linked to readiness. Right? So those of you who have been here before, you know I'm just going to put it up quickly. We've got sort of our version of the fence slides. Equality is a myth, that everybody needs the same thing. Equity really is about acknowledging that the playing field isn't level, and acknowledging that the barriers that are often baked in to our systems are not level. Some young people and families really face major structural barriers that are baked in. So we have to understand both of those things. We have to ask whether the goal is just to be able to have kids see over the fence, or is the goal actually to really take the fence down so that they can get into the game? And if they're going to get in the game, we then have to say, are they ready? So this leaves us with the question of, when we talk about equity, we often end up talking about reducing barriers, and we have to simultaneously be talking about getting young people ready for the game, and frankly, making sure we know which game they want to participate in, because they may not all want to play baseball. I didn't. So let's find out what that is. Part of the reason I wanted to put this graphic up is that, and I think Vivian asked this question yesterday, it's like, how do we acknowledge, when we're talking about how to bring this science into our learning settings to increase young people's potential, how do we acknowledge those deep issues, right? About the playing field not being level and about the fences not being even. And we have to do that. But there's something going on that we're going to push at, which is there clearly are persistent contextual and structural barriers which are pushing down both our expectations about what young people can do, and they're pushing down the actual accomplishments of young people, because those barriers are there and they are real and they are dulling young people's potential. But what we're learning and what we heard over the past couple of days is that we actually have the knowledge, and if we have the motivation, we can really train and inspire adults to use strategies for optimizing youth potential, even in the face of those barriers. And that's the conversation that we want to have. And so we need to talk about the power of, in the meantime, improvements and the science behind them, so that we're not just going to be complacent and say, well, if we can't fix the big things, we can't do anything. And in conversations that we've had over the past couple of days, what was clear, at least to me, is when we start to name those environments more specifically, we can get people to move from we can't do it to maybe we can do it, right? So I was in a conversation in which folks said, you know, that's great, but schools are high stakes accountability. We can't bring this stuff into schools. It won't work. And then you said, well, I know that the core academic subjects are high stakes, but aren't there other things in schools that are lower stakes, where we get the adults that are in the library, in the cafeteria, running the extracurricular classes? Couldn't they be trying out some of these ideas? Couldn't they become ambassadors for relationship building? Can't we get some of these things happening in some of the places where kids spend their time inside of that building that we all think of as just high stakes? So it's important for us to really start to practice, to push to ask, can't it happen somewhere? Because what we know is it is happening somewhere. It's just not happening somewhere consistently, and we're actually not giving people credit for it. So we need to figure out how to start to change our expectations about what can happen. This idea of readiness is one that we come back to every year because the dictionary definition of readiness says two things. It's the willingness to do something, and it's the state of actually being prepared to do something. So when the military talks about military readiness, they're talking about preparedness, not just are we willing to go, but are we fully prepared? The reason I like to come back to the word readiness and bring it into this conversation is often what we're doing, and everything that we just looked at, we're actually measuring young people's behavior. What do we see them doing? And what we need to understand is that what we see is a combination of capacity, and this is for anybody, of capacity, of motivation, and of opportunity, in particular of your assessment of the opportunity. So that's why we can have a young person who in one setting looks completely nonplussed, bored, not participating, and in a different setting is up on the stage as the star of the show, right? They didn't suddenly change capacities. Motivation changed. Somehow that opportunity changed. And what I want to talk about for a minute as we're having these conversations about equity and belonging in relationships is how do we make sure that this idea of belonging really fits in? So belonging is a fundamental need, right? It's not a want, it's not chocolate, it's a fundamental need. We all have that need for it. And the question then that we have to look at, and you heard some of this morning on the panel with Hikma, you heard her say, I was in some of these rooms because I was absolutely committed, but I was also exhausted because I didn't feel I belonged, right? I stuck it out, but I really, didn't feel that I would belong. I didn't feel welcome to in these meetings. I didn't feel comfortable. And so in a very simple way, when you have a young person, 5 years old, whatever age you want to be, and something simple happens, right? Marita walks by me and she doesn't say hi. If I'm not sure I belong, I'm going to interpret that as she doesn't like me, or maybe even generalize it to nobody likes me. And then I'm going to put less effort towards relationships. But if I feel like I do belong, I'm going to interpret it as she didn't see me. I'm going to give it a temporary assignment, not a permanent assignment. And I'm going to say, well, maybe I'll just be more direct next time and say, Rita, say hi when you walk by me. Two very different things, but imagine over and over again, if this happens, we're changing young people's motivation, we're changing their assessment of the opportunity of whether this is a safe space, and that's why in this big conversation about equity, while we're trying to address structural inequality and discrimination, we're trying to get and tackle these inequitable outcomes, which we've seen we're not to be budging on our gaps, achievement gaps, et cetera. Looking at that basic idea, which you heard over and over again yesterday, of what happens when young people don't feel that they belong, means that there are meantime strategies we can be using now. We can be using them right now. Because if we use them, young people then are more likely to show us their capacity. They are more likely then to demonstrate that they're motivated, right? And they are then more likely to actually see the opportunities that we're creating as real opportunities and safe places for them to learn, so we're getting the behaviors that we want. All of this adds up, and I know you all have examples, and you should type in some of those examples. So, when we ask the question of what does it look like when we create settings in which we maximize belonging and relationship building, we ask this just happens to be one list. We ask this question to folks all the time, and the list looks pretty much the same. And these are things that all of us know. These are things that are sort of back in that conversation about what learning looks like. And when I did this conversation with K-12 educators, they came up with pretty much the same list. And in fact, that idea about breaking down where learning happens in the building and outside of the building came from them, because when asked where does that happen, the first thing they said was, well, not in school. So, you all know, many of you know that the Weichert Center has the Youth Program Quality Assessment and has recently sort of created and now has the core form of the SEL Program Quality Assessment. And it's really sort of bringing into an operationalization the idea that we can assess whether we are creating environments in which our best bet is that young people feel that they belong, so that they can build their capacity, so that they can explore. We still have to check. We still have to make sure that that environment is safe for all young people, and not just some of them. but we have a process for doing it. So I want to end this back with the slide that we put up yesterday that was from Michael Lamb. This idea of when a young person is walking into the door, this happens to be the door of a school, they're not just going into one environment. They're going into multiple environments. By the time that young person comes back out the door at the end of the day, they've opened many doors. And every one of those doors has an opportunity for that quote that we had up yesterday, which so many people thought was an aha. I put it back up, right? That we possess a tremendous power to make a child's life miserable or joyous, basically by the reactions that we have to who they are and their behavior. We possess that power. That is an intervention that every one of us can have. That's an intervention that we can inspire other people to understand. Parents, volunteers, for us to understand it's not just about delivering content. It's not just about setting up the environment. It is actually about understanding that the brain research tells us every interaction matters, right? So that power that you carry, the question, if we're going to blur the lines, is who's the you? So I put this back up again. All of us are the you. Who are the other yous? How do we move this forward? Because the dilemma is we are all in organizations in which the official practice doesn't necessarily or explicitly name what we now know as good developmental practice. And so there's a lot of stuff happening in the gray areas that we can be explicit about. And the more we're bringing this science into our work, the more we actually have an opportunity to be explicit about acknowledging when people are sort of pushing on to the boundaries and doing things well. And the more we have an opportunity to begin to sort of put in place policies, I don't mean big public policies, I mean organizational policies, like we welcome all of our children. Organizational policies can make a huge difference in what we're doing because we know that we're creating environments, we're putting people in those environments that have expectations and standards. How we hire people, how we train people, how we set up expectations is important. How we put the experiences together for young people is important in space and time. So we're trying to blur the lines between educational equity to increase ownership and engagement across the settings. And if we do that, we reinforce the roles that families, communities, and peers can play in this. We specify that there's a full range of learning environments that all of them need to be assessed and improved and acknowledged and reinforced. So we promote consistent standards. We acknowledge that there are adult educators can cross boundaries and are in multiple spaces. So we acknowledge the parents and youth workers that are coming into schools. We affirm the need for consistent recognition and cross-training, recognize that there are cumulative impact differences in access and quality across learning settings, and then we need to advocate for more and better data and disaggregated data, and highlight, obviously, the need for more and better funded supports to coordinate partnering. So all of that is the stuff that we have to do in order to beat the odds, not just beat the odds, but actually change the odds. And that's just what this conference is about, that's what the forum has been about, and that's what we are hoping you will go home and do. I was going to tell you more about our partners and the exciting thing that we're doing with each of them, with the Urban League, with the University of Pittsburgh, with Turnaround for Children, with the Chicago Consortium, but we're out of time, so I'm going to turn to Rita to see if there's any burning question that's come in.
The biggest question that we've gotten through this conversation is really on that, how do we overall change the odds, and on the policy question, not just on the organizational policy, but what's being done policy writ large. So I'll just read it straight. What policy work is being done to make this work more sustainable financially and emotionally for the adults who comprise the system supporting young people? So there's been a huge policy element of this.
Read it again for me.
What policy work is being done to make this work more sustainable financially and emotionally for the adults who comprise the systems supporting young people?
All right, so I'm going to say one thing, and then I'm going to say I'm going to turn to, oh good, it's up on the screen, or up on my screen, I guess. We've got folks here from the policy space. We've got Dan Gilbert here. I don't know whether Terry Ferdinand is still here or not, from 50 Schools Network on the after-school side. There are organizations that are really coming together now to figure out how to take the openings that have been put in to the policy recommendations coming out of the commission concretely and make sure that we move those things forward. But at the community level, for example, one of the things that we saw at the forum, and in fact this was so big that Elizabeth Gaines, who was doing this work, sort of spun off to do it full time, is that we saw probably a threefold increase in the number of communities that decided, like they've done here in King County, to create a dedicated funding stream. To really make sure that these kind of opportunities and opportunities to really support adults in this work were being funded locally, so it wasn't sort of haphazard whether the federal government was doing it or not. So we are seeing movement in that space, but I'm going to welcome other people to sort of chime in, and if that's the conversation that we really want to have, we'll make one of our thought leader sessions focused on policy.
Yeah, we had some other questions in terms of specifics on research and what people are doing on the ground, and I think a lot of those we're going to be covering in the thought leader calls that Karen mentioned earlier, so we'll have a chance to really have those conversations in an ongoing way. And then I know a huge number of folks in here are actually coming to the super session where we're going to be exploring some of the research behind this. That's the session that's happening right after this one.
Good. I can't see very well. Nobody's standing at mics, best I can tell. Up. There's a question.
Mm-hmm. Hi, Karen. Greg Williamson from Washington State. Nice to see you. I have a question about my peers that's kind of related to the question we just had and the answer you just suggested from the community level. So I work for Washington State government for the Department of Children, Youth, and Families, which is child welfare, juvenile rehabilitation, and early learning all together in a prevention ball of fun to try to figure out how to improve outcomes across health, education, and resilience. And we recently have established a state-level Office of Youth Engagement, where we work directly with young people, the staff that support them, partner organizations in K-12 and nonprofits, and agency leadership to do two things. One is accelerate the progress towards the kinds of outcomes you're talking about by working directly with young people to engage them in the process and content delivery of the programs. And two, to learn as an agency how do we do our program delivery better by working with young people as if they were people. So if there are people in other states that are doing anything like that at the state level, I'm super interested in talking with y'all because a bunch of us are gathering in Philadelphia soon. But if you are about youth engagement, youth empowerment, youth driven, and these kinds of things, I'm interested in your national policy conversation, of course. But at the state level, we're trying to organize, like Best Starts is at the county level.
Great.
What are the other state things?
That's terrific. And again, I cannot see out there in the world, so I can't tell whether Thaddeus or Mary Ellen are out there in the audience somewhere, but there he is in the back. But again, when we can pull this together, the Forum Youth Investment has for the past 10 plus years supported the Children's Cabinet Network, which really brings together the staff and leads at any given time, sort of 20 to 30 states have these children's cabinets, which are bringing the different agencies together to really work on these kinds of common problems and common solutions. And this is one of the things that we want to very deliberately take back to those networks. Often the K-12 education folks are at the table, but not as strongly at the table as we would like in those networks. And this is an opportunity to do that. It's also an opportunity for us to, because the question was about sort of how do we really support the adults. All of these budgets have budgets for training, for professional development, which are often siloed. And so one of the questions is, can we be more efficient when we have a recommendation that says build adult capacity to understand child development? How can we do that in more efficient ways across our organizations and across our public agencies? I'm now officially out of time, I think. Chris is coming this direction.
Mr. Mann is right over there.